Are you ready to cry? Are you ready to hug a pillow? Because we're talking about the national debt, which is so out of control. So out of control, in fact, that it is now approaching $35 trillion. So we have a major problem with this debt. In 1980, our national debt was under $1 billion. In 2009, just 15 years ago, it was $12 trillion, which is an exorbitant amount, but compared to now, it seems like just a tiny number. In 2014, it was $17 trillion, and now our national debt is approaching $35 trillion. That means it has doubled over the past 10 years, and it has tripled over the past 15 years. 7 trillion, just to give you some line items, roughly 7 trillion of that, now approaching $35 trillion, was spent on 21st century wars, as I call them, misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which did not need to happen, but nevertheless, we spent $7 trillion. According to a website called COVID Money Tracker, we spent upwards of $4 trillion on COVID response, assistance alone. And so we are really in a bad situation. And as I said earlier in the show, we talk a lot on this program and just in our national discourse about the threat of wokeism, of anti-Americanism, of our decrepit schools, of dwindling test scores. I certainly talk a great deal about the threat posed by China, their staggering ascension and their campaign to infiltrate and subvert the United States. And as pressing as all of those issues are, I think actually perhaps the biggest issue that we are facing is this debt crisis. By the way, as I was doing research on this, I happened upon an article by CBS News. Look at who they blame the national debt on. Can you guess? Orange man bad.
Is it orange and
yes.
loud? Yeah.
Shocking, right? Let's pull that up one more time. I want people to see it. Ready? Quote, "The nation's ballooning debt stems chiefly from tax cuts enacted by former President Donald Trump in 2017. Oh, right. Our $35 trillion debt is, according to CBS, stemmed chiefly from tax cuts by Trump. It's absurd to say that the debt stems chiefly from almost anything, because there are, so many different ways our debt has increased. But so to blame it on one person is absurd, but also tax cuts, as we're about to talk about, tax cuts stimulate the economy generally. Of course, in some cases it doesn't, but generally tax cuts give people more capital to go out and spend in the economy, whereas tax increases, you think that you're basically collecting free revenue for the government, but it makes people less likely to go out and spend as much as they would in the economy. And also when you tax people heavily, it trickles down to the people who they employ, because they have to cut those people's salaries, they have to cut benefits, etc. So the whole sentence is just absurd. But are we shocked, right, with CBS News? But here are the important things to know about the debt, in addition to the fact that it is an insanely large number, 35 trillion with a T dollars. Here are two other important things. As a line item, interest on our debt this year, fiscal year 2024, will exceed defense spending. That is the first time that this has ever happened in our nation's history. Defense spending, I believe, is the number one, if not in the top three line items that we spend our money on. And this year, interest on the debt, so what we are paying for having massive debt, what we are paying to borrow to continue to spend, that is going to exceed $890 billion. And the Congressional Budget Office estimates that it will go as high as $1.5 trillion in the next 10 years. That's interest on our debt alone. So we are in big trouble. We see this in life where if you don't deal with a problem, it begets more problems, which beget more problems. Just again, like think about, people who overeat, right? It's a problem of your health. And if you don't fix that, then it becomes a problem of, your personal life. It becomes a problem of the way that you view yourself. It becomes a problem with your medical expense. Like things compound. So does interest. So does, borrowing insanely. It's not just all of this crazy spending, but it's that we have to pay for spending that much money. It's absolutely crazy. So
It's like, as an expert overeater, I can speak to this. 35 trillion is such a large number, it's almost hard to comprehend.
it is.
A trillion is 1,000 billion.
That's
So
1
that's
trillion.
$35,000 billion.
It's horrible.
Whew.
It is absolutely horrible. So that's the first important thing. Really important. Interest on the debt this year is projected to exceed defense spending. That is a huge problem. And then the second thing with regard to interest is that half of our debt, half of that $35 trillion is financed short term, which means that it is sensitive to what the current interest rates are. So if we borrow money and, we have a long-term agreement, then we just pay the interest rate that we agreed on, 20 years ago, whenever we took that out. But now, especially as interest rates are increasing to combat inflation, we have to pay the new interest rates with half of our debt, which is financed short-term. So that is just making the interest go up, 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 up. So it's a massive, massive problem. So in order to combat this massive problem, we had the President of the United States unravel just a spectacular plan, spectacular in its incompetence and irresponsibleness. Yesterday, President Biden proposed a budget for the fiscal year 2025. He is proposing to have spending at $7.3 trillion in the fiscal year 2025, when we're already $35 trillion in debt. That is a $1.1 trillion increase over 2 years ago. So look, the president is proposing this, then people fight about it. It has to pass in Congress. So the good news is that this is probably not going to actually happen. But the bad news is this is what our president is prioritizing, and many members of his political party are supporting. And even if a watered down version of this is going to be passed, it's still going to be many trillions of dollars that we just cannot afford, especially with interest on top of that. But not to worry, because President Biden says although he is proposing $7.3 trillion in spending in the fiscal year 2025, this will decrease the deficit by $3.3 trillion over 10 years, he said. So by spending $7 trillion, we're going to cut back on $3 trillion. By the way, of course, sometimes that happens. Sometimes you have to spend and stimulate the economy in order to lessen, if you will, the federal deficit. But here's the thing. If you look at where he thinks that money is going to come from, it's tax increases. So President Biden is proposing nearly $5 trillion, just under $5 trillion, $4.9 trillion in tax increases for those who have an income level over $400,000. Now you listen to that and you think, well, great, right? People over $400,000, they make a lot of money, they should be heavily taxed. Well, there are many problems with this. First, as very astutely observed by the Wall Street Journal, that $400,000 doesn't account for the inflation, which went up as high as 9% over the past 2 years. So President Biden in 2020 ran on this campaign promise to levy exorbitantly high taxes on those who make over $400,000. But he was saying that back in 2020. As inflation has gone up, again, as high as 9% a few years ago, people's incomes have not been adjusted for that. And so actually making $400,000 isn't as big of a deal now. I mean, of course it is. My God, that's a lot of money. But it isn't as big of a deal now. It is not as much money as it was when he was talking about it in 2020 because of inflation. But putting that aside, this whole idea of, we're going to levy these crazy high taxes on people as a way to collect revenue. That's not fair, I don't think, to the American worker who works every day of his or her life to make money and then sees a whole chunk of that go to the government so they can spend it on, climate change. But also, economically, it doesn't make sense. Because as I said, when you tax people, you are lessening the amount of capital that they can go out and spend in the economy. And one of the big things that President Biden talks about, including most recently during his State of the Union last Thursday, is raising the income tax rate for corporations to 28% and also bringing the minimum corporate tax rate from 15% up to 21%. Now this sounds really good, right? Big bad corporations, tax them, to death, make them pay, rich people pay. And look, obviously, I think corporations should be taxed, as all of us are. However, when you're proposing a 28% tax on income tax rate on corporations, you're offsetting that. They are going to offset the taxes that they have to pay by making other adjustments with the amount of people that they employ, the amount that they pay those people. If they have less money, then they have less money to pay their workers and employ more workers. So it doesn't quite make sense. What you really want to do is tax people appropriately, but give people a lot of capital so that they can go out, spend it in the economy, hire people, start businesses, etc. It's just a backward, in my view at least, way of looking at things. So this is crazy. $7.3 trillion he's proposing in the fiscal year 2025. Another important thing to note about that is that he is only proposing to increase defense spending by 1%. To be $895 billion for the next fiscal year. Now, only $850 billion of that would actually go to the Pentagon, because about $50 billion of that $895 billion is going to these Energy Department national defense programs. And as we've seen on the show, there are these weird things that are going on with defense. For instance, there was a 2021 National Defense Authorization Act, which created a naming commission with our taxpayer money, a naming commission where there are people on this committee within the Department of Defense who are in charge of going around and removing Confederate statues, because under this National Defense Act, they view it as a threat to our defense to have Confederate statues up. So the point is, this money, we think, $895 billion is going to our national defense. Well, not all of it is going to guns and boots on the ground and, sprucing up our equipment and our military facilities. A lot of it is going to BS stuff like that. But another important note about this too is that I'm all for cutting back spending. And we have to, if we are going to avoid this catastrophe, we have to majorly cut back spending. But but defense spending should not be the thing that we are cutting back on, especially now when we are living in a world that many say appropriately is as unsafe and unstable as the 1930s were, predating World War II. We have the biggest massacre in Israel's history, this war between Israel and Gaza, perhaps which will enter into a war with Iran, a newly emboldened and cash-flushed Iran, thanks to Joe Biden's terrible policies. We also had that disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal where $85 billion, which also is a part of our debt, of equipment went to the Taliban. We have China on the march. We had China says that it wants to invade Taiwan. We had Putin invade Ukraine. We have North Korea rewriting its constitution to say that they want to reclaim, reoccupy, and resubjugate South Korea. We're in a very dangerous world right now. We've got to increase our defense spending far more than this and cut back on these other crazy programs.
In addition to living in a dangerous world and needing defense, you're talking about social programs like Social Security and Medicare that may not be sustainable if we continue along this path, right?
Totally. And
then the angry part of me is can we please curtail the spending? I remember screaming a couple of weeks back, I want receipts. I want to know where our tax dollars are going. Every time I see a headline that says, oh, we've managed to avert a government shutdown again, I go, I should hope so. And if the government ever shuts down, I want you all fired. You're being paid to do our work, and you're just blowing this money all over the place, and you're going to fix it by taxing us or taxing corporations that will trickle down the cost to us or hurt our wages?
Yes.
Come on.
Yes.
It's taxation without representation.
Well, the way that you just phrased it was so good about corporations, because when you hear this idea of tax corporations, you picture the people in the C-suite. You picture the CEOs who are rich and driving Lamborghinis and Maseratis, and you have this idea that you're taxing them. But really, as you say, it trickles down to you and me sitting right here. Those are the people that we should be picturing when we're talking about taxing corporations. But here's another thing. You're talking about Social Security, which is a big issue, right? And so President Biden, during the State of the Union, gave this, angry thing where he goes, if you Republicans cut Social Security and all these programs, I will stop you. And everyone's like, oh my God, he's such a hero. He wants people to get retirement money. Joe's our king. Love you, Joe. Okay, all right. No Republican would like to cut Social Security. No, let me rephrase it. No Republican wants to cut Social Security. No person wants to cut Social Security. If Social Security were to be cut, it is because we are barreling towards a brick wall. This whole idea that Republicans are these mean people. They hate women, they hate black people, they hate old people, they hate immigrants, they hate you, they hate trans people, they hate trees, they hate the environment. The whole thing is based on hate. It's not based on hate. It's based on common sense. And we may have to make some really tough decisions in order to save a much tougher catastrophe from occurring. And you know what really frosts my cookies? When President Biden is talking about, oh, don't cut Social Security. Look at the way that this money is being allocated. I have a picture here from the New York Post of the different kind of major ways that President Biden wants to allocate this $7.3 trillion in spending in the fiscal year 2025. And one of them, you'll see, is $23 billion for climate adaptation and resilience. This is picture 3. $23 billion for climate adaptation and resilience. Oh, I don't know if we have it. Take my word for it. $23 billion. Just a few more quick notes on this. Very important. This is, by the way, I know you were saying I'm trying to follow you. These are the bullet notes, the bullet points. These are the spark notes. According to the Congressional Budget Office, they estimate that if we continue down this road of these policies, the federal debt will grow by $21 trillion in 10 years, which means by the end of the fiscal year 2034, we will have a $48 trillion national debt. So we have to understand two things: irresponsible spending and irresponsible economic policies. That is what has led us here. Irresponsible spending on these crazy wars. But the irresponsible spending continues. Look at President Biden's student loan forgiveness program. That is a disaster. And it's not student loan forgiveness. It's student loan transference. Because maybe the people who have taken out the loans are not paying the bill, but someone else is, i.e. the American taxpayer. Look at the $53 million program in New York City by the mayor, Eric Adams, to give illegal immigrants prepaid debit cards. The housing, the medical care that is given to illegal immigrants. That's an enormous amount of spending. Also, I'm going to do a segment on this. The World Health Organization and many United Nations entities, such as one on global migration, weirdly, get billions of dollars in our taxpayer money and spending. So as you say, Sean, we need receipts. I want to know where my money is going towards, because if it's going to prepaid debit cards and it's going to the UN migration program, or it's going to the Michelle Obama walkway in Atlanta, Georgia, which was really something that our taxpayer money is being spent on, or an LGBTQ resource museum center, another thing that this is being spent on, I've got a problem with that. And this is when the president's talking about cutting Social Security, we need to consider all of these other things that they're spending their money on. It's not fair.
Yeah,
There's also irresponsible economic policies, namely, as Donald Trump would say, we need to drill, baby, drill. We need to be energy independent. That is a way to stimulate economic growth. It is a way to stimulate jobs. We were energy independent under President Trump. We were energy independent for many decades of the 20th century. We think, oh, we just don't have the resources here. We do. But one of President Biden's, I think actually his first executive order when he came into office, was to cut the Keystone XL pipeline. which is obscene. He recently said that the liquefied natural gas exports, he cut that off. I mean, this is crazy on so many levels. That's not fair.
And it's not just oil. Like, oil is almost the past now. We are in the lithium age, and China has been eating our lunch when it comes to lithium, and we are behind on that. They praise Joe for being a future thinker for all these chip manufacturing things that he's set up that have yet to start. But lithium is where it's at. We need to cut the red tape, and we should be mining for lithium immediately.
That's why I keep you around. Excellent point.